Let us strip away the delusions. What you are witnessing in Ukraine is not a heroic resistance on the verge of victory. It is not a righteous crusade that will be vindicated by history. It is the final desperate stage of a proxy war that the West has already lost structurally, militarily, and strategically. The recent rhetoric from Kyiv demanding immediate NATO membership as the price of continued fighting is not a sign of strength. It is the admission of collapse dressed up as defiance. And the refusal of Western capitals to grant this demand is not caution. It is the quiet acknowledgement that this war was unwinnable from the beginning and that the costs of pretending otherwise have become unbearable. The Ukrainian leadership now finds itself in an impossible position. After 2.5 years of attrition, after hundreds of thousands of casualties, after the exhaustion of mobilization reserves and the depletion of Western stockpiles, Kyiv is presenting NATO membership as the only rational continuation of the war effort. This is not diplomacy. This is extortion born of desperation. The logic is clear. If the West wants Ukraine to keep fighting, it must guarantee Ukraine's security with Article 5. If it will not, then the war effort collapses under its own weight. This is not a game. This is the end game of a strategy that was doomed by the structure of the international system from the moment it began. Let me be clear about what NATO membership for Ukraine actually represents. It is not a policy option. It is a civilizational risk that no rational great power would accept. Bringing Ukraine into NATO while it is at war with Russia means bringing NATO into direct war with Russia. It means transforming a proxy conflict into a great power confrontation between nuclear-armed states. It means the end of escalation management and the beginning of existential brinkmanship. The leadership in Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris understands this perfectly well. That is why they will not do it. That is why they have never seriously intended to do it. And that is why Zelensky's demand is not a negotiating position. It is a public performance designed to shift blame for the coming defeat. The West response has been predictable. Warm words, vague commitments, promises of long-term support, but no Article 5, no treaty, no membership action plan, because the reality understood by every serious analyst of great power politics is that Ukraine's strategic value to the West does not justify the risk of nuclear war with Russia. It never did. The expansion of NATO eastward, the cultivation of Ukraine as a security partner, the encouragement of its integration into Western institutions, all of this was pursued not because Ukraine's survival was a vital interest of the United States, but because it was believed that Russia could be weakened, humiliated, and contained without significant cost. That assumption has been proven catastrophically wrong. This is what happens when liberal ideologues are allowed to make grand strategy. They confuse preferences with capabilities. They mistake rhetoric for reality. They believe that if they declare something often enough, democracy will prevail, autocracy will collapse, the rules-based order will hold, then the structure of the international system will bend to accommodate their worldview. It does not. It never has. And in Ukraine, the price of this delusion is being paid in blood by people who were told they were fighting for freedom, when in fact they were being used as instruments in a geopolitical competition. Their patrons were never willing to win. Let us examine the military situation with the cold clarity it demands. Ukraine has not collapsed. It is not surrendered, but it is being ground down in a war of attrition. It cannot win. The Russian military, after its chaotic and humiliating failures in the opening months of the war, has adapted. It has mobilized its industrial base. It has expanded its army. It has learned to fight a methodical, grinding campaign that prioritizes firepower over maneuver, attrition over breakthrough. This is not a glamorous form of warfare. It does not produce viral videos of drones striking tank. It produces relentless artillery bombardment, gradual territorial gains, and the systematic destruction of Ukrainian manpower and material, and it is working. The mathematics of this war are brutal and deterministic. Russia has a population 3 times the size of Ukraine's. It has an industrial base that, while inefficient and corrupt, is nevertheless capable of producing artillery shells, missiles, and drones at a scale that the combined defense industries of the West cannot match in the short term. It has a willingness to accept casualties that no Western democracy would tolerate, and it has time. Ukraine does not. Every month that passes sees the mobilization pool shrink, the average age of frontline soldiers rise, and the capacity to sustain offensive operations diminish. The much celebrated counteroffensive of 2023 failed not because of poor tactics or insufficient motivation, but because Ukraine lacked the artillery ammunition, the air superiority, and the manpower reserves necessary to break through prepared Russian defenses. Those shortages have not been remedied, they have worsened. Western military aid, while substantial in dollar terms, has never been sufficient to change the trajectory of the war. The provision of tanks, artillery systems, and air defense platforms has allowed Ukraine to slow the rate of its defeat, but not to reverse it. The reluctance to provide long-range strike systems, fighter air, and the authorization to strike deep into Russian territory reflects a fundamental ambivalence at the heart of Western strategy. The desire to hurt Russia without provoking it, to support Ukraine without committing to its victory, to manage the conflict without defining what victory would even mean. This is not a strategy. This is the avoidance of strategy, and it has produced exactly the outcome that any student of great power politics would have predicted. A grinding stalemate that favors the side with greater resources and greater willingness to endure suffering. Now consider the broader strategic picture. The United States is not a global hegemon with infinite resources and infinite attention. It is a great power in relative decline, facing a peer competitor in China that is more dangerous, more capable, and more central to American long-term security than Russia has ever been. Every dollar spent on Ukraine is a dollar not spent on the Pacific. Every artillery shell sent to Kyiv is a shell not available for a potential conflict over Taiwan. Every month spent fixated on a war in Eastern Europe is a month in which China continues its military buildup, its economic expansion, and its efforts to displace the United States as the dominant power in Asia. The United States is attempting to wage a proxy war against a nuclear-armed regional power while simultaneously preparing for a potential great power war against the world's second-largest economy. It cannot do both effectively, and the attempt to do so is eroding its capacity to do either. The tragedy of this war is that it was avoidable. Not easily avoidable, not obviously avoidable, but avoidable nonetheless. The structure of the international system made conflict between Russia and the West over Ukraine highly likely once the decision was made to expand NATO eastward and to treat Ukraine as a de facto member of the Western security community. Russia, as a great power in an interactive system, could not tolerate the placement of a hostile military alliance on its most vulnerable border. This is not a moral judgment. This is not an endorsement of Russian action. This is a statement of fact about how great powers behave when they perceive existential threats to their security. The United States would react no differently if a hostile great power attempted to incorporate Mexico into a military alliance aimed at Washington. It has reacted no differently in its own hemisphere for more than a century. The failure of Western policymakers was not in misunderstanding Russian intentions. It was in believing that Russian fears could be dismissed as illegitimate, that assurances and guarantees could substitute for structural security, and that a combination of economic sanctions and military aid could compel Russia to accept a strategic outcome. It viewed as unacceptable. This was hubris, and hubris in international politics is not punished by embarrassment. It is punished by defeat. And so we arrive at the present moment. Zelensky demands NATO membership. NATO refuses. The war continues. Ukrainian casualties mount. Russian advances slow but steady accumulate. Western publics grow weary. The political will to sustain this effort arose. And the only question that remains is not whether Ukraine will achieve the maximalist goals it was promised. The restoration of all territory, the defeat of Russia, the vindication of the rules-based order, but rather how much more destruction will occur before reality is acknowledged. The leadership class in the West will not admit this. They cannot. To admit that the war was unwinnable is to admit that the strategy was fundamental flaw. To admit that NATO expansion provoked this conflict is to admit that their grand vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace was a fantasy that ignored the basic dynamics of great power competition. And so they will continue to speak of unwavering support of Ukraine's courage, of the moral necessity of resistance. They will continue to provide just enough aid to prolong the war, but not enough to win it. They will continue to promise a future that will never arrive. And the people of Ukraine who believe those promises will continue to pay the price. This was avoidable. The unipolar moment is over. The attempt to extend Western hegemony into Russia's sphere of influence is off. And no amount of rhetoric, no matter how stirring, can alter the mathematics of attrition or the logic of great power politics. You cannot spin your way out of it.